Well, joining me from Chicago is the Iranian-American journalist and analyst with the International Crisis Group, Azadeh Moaveni. And in Washington, D.C. is James Carafano from the U.S. think tank, the Heritage Foundation. Welcome to you both. Azadeh Moaveni, if I can start with you. Iran has categorically denied involvement. The U.S. has released these satellite images as evidence. What's your assessment of the situation?
I think we can't assign. It's too difficult to assign culpability right now. That is a process that needs to be meticulous and take some time. I think if we were to, for the sake of argument and trying to understand why Iran might be motivated to do such a thing, we could see it as in line with Iran pushing back against the U.S. policy of maximum pressure, which is in effect strangling Iran's economy. Iran cannot export any oil. It's a large country of 80 million people. And Iran could be trying to signal that this sort of policy will be a lose-lose for the entire region, that it will impose costs on U.S. allies whose oil infrastructure is very vulnerable, and that if Iran is to be blockaded and to suffer, then others will suffer alongside it.
OK, James Carafano, last week we heard suggestions that the U.S. administration was looking at easing sanctions, that they were seeking a meeting with President Rouhani. Now, in response to the attack, we're hearing President Trump ramp up the rhetoric, talking about being locked and loaded. What's the strategy here?
Well, I would say that a lot of the discussions about a possible meeting was just speculation. None of that actually came officially from the U.S. government. U.S. policy has actually been pretty clear. The United States is always willing to talk with Iran if Iran's willing to curb its extreme behavior. And I think that remains the U.S. policy. I think it's unlikely that the U.S. would meet at this point, given that Iran just did essentially, if they directly did this, it was an act of war. If they didn't directly do it, they provided the capacity and capability to surrogates who did it, and it's a very aggressive act. So I think a meeting at this point is likely unlikely, though I think the U.S. policy remains the same. The maximum pressure campaign remains in place until Iran is a responsible actor. And when Iran wants to talk about a better deal in which it will act responsibly in the region, then the United States is willing to listen.
OK, but when you talk about maximum pressure, are we now talking about military action?
I don't think so in this case. I think the U.S. has three things on its to-do list. One is the maximum pressure campaign, which is in place to protect the region from the ugly and destabilizing acts of Iran. The second is to keep the Strait of Hormuz open, which really the United States' only military power has the capability to do that. And I think the third is to support our allies. Look, this was a direct attack on the people of Saudi Arabia. I think the response has to be led by the people of Saudi Arabia. The Saudis have to decide how they're going to respond to protect their territory. And I think the U.S. as a good ally would help support and affirm that. But I don't think it's appropriate that the U.S. take the lead in retaliating, particularly as I agree that I think at this point we have, at least publicly, contradictory and incomplete information on the responsible parties. And I think that has to be clear first before any kind of coercive action or any other kind of response would be undertaken.
OK. Azadeh, the idea that the Saudis should decide what the response should be, I think many Americans may find that surprising. What do you think about that?
It's a bit disingenuous. It's the U.S. policy of maximum pressure is what has brought us to this extremely dangerous moment that we're in today. Maximum pressure against Iran, which has failed to achieve any of its objectives. It has destabilized the region and brought us to the brink of war. The failed policy in Yemen, which is prolonging the starvation of Yemenis, which is prolonging that war. The Yemenis and the Houthis they have their own agency as well. Of course, Iran may have helped cultivate their capabilities, but Iran didn't necessarily pull the trigger. But if we widen the camera and see the state that the region is in today, we see that it's the U.S. policy of maximum pressure that has brought us here. So to speak about that policy in terms of responsibility is a bit alarming, because I think we're closer to war than we ever have been in probably the last 20 years. And really, it's only a moment where we can de-escalate, where the suggestion put forward by President Macron to give Iran incentives to stay in line with the nuclear arrangement and to not escalate like this, I think is the only way we can go.
I need to bring James Carafano back in. Just respond to that the U.S. hasn't exactly been a responsible actor in the region.
Yeah, well, I think the comment's actually pretty fatuous. We got to this point because of Iran's fatuous behavior. And we're not closer to war in the last 20 years because we actually had a war in the last 20 years. And what the U.S. policy is very clearly aimed at doing, it's restraining Iran's behavior, which is this chief destabilizing force that's creating this in the region. And you can't do that by just sitting back and saying, here's $15 billion line of credit and just giving Iran a get-out-of-jail-free card. That makes no sense.
OK, last response, Azadeh.
I mean, Iran has showed that it has incredible strategic depth in the region. It's a large, pivotal country with 80 million people, and it's being led to the brink of economic collapse. I think we can turn around that and go back to the terms of the joint nuclear plan of action that was established and agreed upon exactly to prevent the kind of dangerous escalation that we've arrived at today, and we can turn that back.
Thank you. Azadeh Mourani and James Carafano, thank you both for joining us.